This? No intercommunication between the groups, okay?
Let's keep the working class separate.
Yeah. Sectionalized and marginalized, that's the way we like it. So we're going to be addressing what's become a very imminent issue. It seems very theoretical, and it is theoretical, but it's coming to a head on the streets. We talk about what kind of tactics, what kind of ideology is going to bring the masses together and going to make them march together for their own liberation. Is it going to be black bloc tactics? Is it going to be smashing windows? Is that going to get people to unite together? And I'm not reducing anarchism to this. Is it going to be social economy? Is that something that working class people can unite behind? Or is it going to be program, demands, and struggle? I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to these questions because I have Ryan on my side. So Ryan's going to give us about a 20-minute talk, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. I'll take stack. I might identify you by the color of your shirt or your shoes. But yeah, we're going to have like a really good open discussion and try to sort of tease out the really key points of theoretical or on the street anarchism versus Marxism.
Could I just ask, could we, maybe when the discussion starts, go around so we could know each other's name?
Sure. That's innovative.
Should I go ahead? Should we do the intros first?
My name is Emily. I'm your Vanna White host.
My name is Ryan. I'm from Dorchester. I'm Brian. I'm from
Eric, I'm from New Hampshire.
Justin from New York.
And Alan from New York.
Patrick also from Dorchester.
Dorchester.
I'm Kate, I'm from Maine.
I'm Charlie, I'm from New York. Oh, from Cambridge.
I'm Doug from Reading.
This is Brian.
Brian.
And in Britain, you want to take it away?
Thanks everyone for coming. I hope it's not, obviously when you're talking about a topic like Marxism and Anarchism, it's going to be a little theoretical, but I want to talk about the theory behind it as well as the actual action on it, because that's what's really important, is how these theories play out on the ground. I think this is an important discussion to have, because obviously the Occupy movement has reintroduced a lot of these ideas into working class consciousness about what is the actual tactic to deliver real change and bring a real better quality of life. That's okay. For the reorganization of society, so this is good. It's important to talk about not just the theoretical aspects, but also how these theories play out on the ground. That makes it an important discussion, especially for us as Marxists, to develop our positions on anarchism and the ideas of anarchism.
Speak a little softer because we can.
I'm sorry. That's fine. I'm just on positions of anarchism because obviously, whatever the comparative arguments, it's obviously something that a lot of working class people have been introduced to. They've seen, the bourgeois parties in America, Democrats and Republicans, and oligarchists. They've seen other states that are supposed to be, free, democratic, fall on the wayside to dictatorships and whatnot. Other societies and parties that claim to be socialists and whatnot seem to go to the wayside. But this is, of course, a very old debate. Since before Marx was around, Marx had debated in the First International in the mid-1800s. Lenin had to debate it during the course of the Russian Revolution, and we too have to debate it nowadays in the United States. The question to start with is, what is anarchism? It's very difficult to pin down because it is not necessarily always specific or clear. It could be generally described as a system that opposes any kind of, that rejects the need of the state, sees it as oppressive and unnecessary for society to function. A deeper explanation of it would be that it rejects hierarchical structures altogether, which would be the boss over the worker, the priest above the clergy, the man above the woman, one race above another, and of course the state above the people. So what's wrong with that? Why do we as anarchists disagree with not having hierarchical structures and oppression? The answer is we don't disagree. The answer is, of course, we want a society free of these hierarchical structures of sexism and racism and so on. And what's wrong with why do we disagree with anarchists on the need of the state? Why do we say that we must always have a state? The truth is that we don't disagree on that. We also agree that society needs to have that should be free and be without a state, be without a state machine. We agree with all of that. So we as Marxists and anarchists start from roughly the same point. We're both anti-capitalist, revolutionary, anti-bureaucratic. We want to get rid of the broken, oppressive capitalist state. But we don't always arrive at the same point. We both want to do away with the same crappy society. Things we see, like gross poverty, gross inequality, exploitation for the sake of profit, racism, sexism, and of course the state altogether. Where we differ is how and which this will be in society, about how it will be achieved. And this is a source of the tension between us. But our core division is not necessarily the question of the state. At its core, it's something much deeper than that, which is a scientific analysis of society. Society being and how we can use the scientific analysis to bring society forward. So from a Marxist perspective, what is the state from a Marxist perspective? One of the important works of Marxists on this topic is The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, which deals with a lot of these hierarchical structures, and the origin of the state altogether. So we're going to get a little theoretical for a second. Just read a short quote, because Engels describes it much better than I could, the way the state plays in society. He says, the state is therefore by no means a power forced on society from without, just as little it is the reality of an ethical idea, the image of reality and reason, as Hegel maintained. Rather, it is a production of society at a certain stage of development, and it is the administration of this society has become entangled in insoluble contradiction with itself, and it has split into two irreconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms and classes, with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves, society in fruitless struggle became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power risen in our society, placing itself above it, and alienating itself more and more from it is the state. Now that may seem a little too theoretical. Basically what that means is that the state is not something that was imposed upon society from without. Something that otherwise good-natured people are being duped into these by these evil people into having a state that they don't necessarily need. From a scientific perspective, the state is something that is generated by class antagonisms that exist. Those antagonisms between the landlord and the landless, the worker and the capitalist, what have you, these class antagonisms that cannot be resolved by society as a whole. And so it's something generated by those antagonisms. Because society will simply not be able to function with these antagonisms without some sort of outside arbitrator in order to keep it at bay. So the real question is not whether or not we should have a state. The question is not from a moral perspective of is a state right, is a state wrong, is it good to have a state. From a moral perspective, there's no question that we should not have a state. So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. That's not a quote from Emma Goldman, that's a quote from Lenin who said that. The reality is that, of course, from a moral perspective, without question, we should not have a state. But the question really shouldn't be, should we have a state, should we not have a state? The real question is, if the state is the result of unresolved class antagonisms in society, and a state will always exist if these antagonisms are present, then the real question is, after the revolution, will these antagonisms still be present? And the answer is yes, of course. After every revolution in the past 100 years, you don't see, after every revolution in the past 100 years, what happened to the old owning class, the old ruling class. They didn't, if you saw the Soviet Union in 1989, they became part of the new capitalist aristocracy, the new capitalist class. But in the Russian Revolution in 1917, the ruling class didn't just evaporate, leaving all their wealth there for the workers to lay their hands on. They didn't fly to Jupiter to start a lucrative mining company. They were still around. They were still there trying to fight for their right to continue their rotten exploitative system, and still fighting so that they could take power back from the working class who had seized power at that point. Trying to roll back the clock. Now, classic. One of the oldest arguments that anarchists will have towards Marxists is the outplay of the Soviet Union in the Russian Revolution. And the way that it fell out, they say that this is how Marxism had its test in history and it failed. That the Russian that was happening in the Soviet Union with Stalinism was a direct outcropping of what happened with the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution in Russia, was by no means a coup from above. It was not a small group of people trying to impose their will onto society. It was by every objective account a popular revolution, so popular that prostitutes in the streets and the priests in the churches were going out and revolting and rising up against the people who were oppressing them. And of course, Stalinism did exist. It did happen. That is how it went. Is that it did inevitably lead. It did ultimately lead into a top-down dictatorship. But there are concrete reasons for this. There are concrete reasons why it developed that way. But you can't. It's not really fair to say that Stalinism was just a continuation of Bolshevism because the society was so different under 10 years after the revolution than how it was under the revolution. It had all sorts of democratic rights. They had people meeting up in communities, having forming community councils of the working class. They were called Soviets. That's where the term Soviet comes from. It's a workers' council. Trade unions were free and independent to strike whenever they wanted to and to have be independent from the state. Everyone had the right to vote, which is something new. Women had the right to vote. Traditionally, racial minorities that were denied their civil rights in Russia were given the right to vote, something that they didn't have in the United States at the time. And a multitude of public benefits multitude of benefits like healthcare and education came about as a result of the Russian Revolution. Again, a lot of these democratic rights and social rights were wiped out under when Stalin came to power, but you can't necessarily say that the Bolshevik Revolution is a failure in the sense that it brought about concrete gains for the working class, by and large. So, but the anarchist analysis of this, and what happened in the Soviet Union, is rather straightforward. They say, of course, the Soviet Union became this evil dictatorship because they had a state. Of course, naturally, it came about into this evil dictatorship because they had a state, and all states are therefore evil. But in that respect, anarchists are very much in agreement with the mouthpieces of capitalism in the sense that, of course, it came about as natural process of events. Of course, it was inevitable that this society was going to fail and turn into a dictatorship. But we should also look at the anarchists' great experiment, if you say, their test of history, which would be the Spanish Revolution. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the outplays of the Spanish Revolution, I'll give a brief sum up. Basically, we had a situation in Spain in the 1930s where the old regime had collapsed. It had lost all integrity and lost any ability to rule. So you had a rise of these new states, popular fronts and things like that coming about and falling away, and it led to this, because neither class was able to lay their hands on the state, a massive civil war broke out that lasted 10 years. You had all the elements of the revolution present in Spain. You had a heroic and very militant working class with regular strike actions turning into the workplace. People from over 53 countries came to Spain to help fight the revolution and to see that it won and succeeded. And in all the political organizations that existed in Spain at this time, the CNT was the biggest one. It was the Anarchist Trade Federation in Spain. And then when the revolution happened and started to take place, the CNT found themselves at the head of it. They found themselves in positions of leadership. They were even the revolution was becoming so successful that they even seized power in certain areas like Barcelona and Madrid, were able to organize production on a local level in the country. And the revolution did have those victories. But they were never, it only went so far. It never got to the point where they linked production up on a national level or tried to link their movement up on a national level. And when they chased out the fascists that they were fighting into the countryside or into the south of France, they never tried to take control of the state. And the reason for this is because they didn't, what's his name? Garcia Oliver said they didn't believe in doing that. They didn't believe in doing so. They said that it would be wrong for them. And the CNT was in the best position to lead this revolution to a decisive victory and take control of Spain for the workers and create a free and just society. But they didn't in the end because they did not believe in doing so. And if they had completed that revolution, if they had fought back the fascists, of course Spain sided with Hitler in the Second World War, and perhaps the Second World War would never come about if the revolution had been successful in Spain. So this is evidence that it's simply not enough just to ignore the state. It's not simply not enough to just say, oh, we don't believe in taking state power. We don't believe in putting people who are clearly criminals into jail because that would make us oppressors and we would be as bad as them. This is simply not true. And in the end, the failure of the Spanish Revolution was the failure of the leadership. There wasn't the significant leadership that was present in the Russian Revolution that allowed them to take victory for themselves. Again, to get a little theoretical for a second, here's what Trotsky said about, in talking about the Spanish Revolution, he said, leaders of the CNT, the only important anarchist organization in the world, became in the critical hour bourgeois ministers. They explained their open betrayal of the theory of anarchism by the pressure of exceptional circumstances. But every serious revolutionary organization, however, prepares precisely for exceptional circumstances. The experience of Spain has shown once again the state can be denied in booklets published in normal circumstances by permission of the bourgeois state, but that the conditions of revolution leave no room for denial of the state. They demand, on the contrary, the conquest of the state. Marxists are wholly in agreement with the anarchists in regard to the final goal, the liquidation of the state. Marxists are statists only to the extent that that one cannot achieve the liquidation of the state simply by ignoring it. That's our map. So we disagree fundamentally with how a revolution can be carried out. But it's difficult to deal with anarchism as a whole because it's sort of unclear exactly how an anarchist revolution would play out. Even to the people who are considered blanket it's difficult to criticize anarchism at this point because they just have, you can't really identify clear political points in their ideology other than just a blanket hatred of authoritarian structures. Even among the major contributors to anarchism anarchist thought, which would be like Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin, none of them really agree on how an anarchist society would actually be grown or how a revolution would play out. Proudhon was more of an anarcho-capitalist, feeling that production should be socialized, but the products themselves should be privately owned. Kropotkin made the central economy, central planning of the economy, and Bakunin thought the society, anarchist society, was something like Jefferson's idea of a group of philosopher farmers coming together like that. And even today, anarchists and Occupy don't really agree on any major principles. Some of them are pro-union, some are anti-union, some are for spontaneous direct action, some are for coordinated mass action, some want to invite politicians to come speak to them and talk things out, some of them want to go and burn their houses down. So what we end up fighting...
First talk to them, number.
Yeah. That's how you get them out of the house. They don't want to come talk. Yeah. Oh, I guess that's the point. But anyway, so what we end up butting heads on more often than not is tactics and strategy and things like that. But in general, you'll see that anarchists are more in favor of spontaneous direct action rather than coordinated mass action. You see this in an action called the Black Bloc. The Black Bloc is typically where a contingent of anarchists will enter into a protest wearing all black, and a protest that may otherwise be a peaceful protest, begin to destroy storefronts, cars, and fist fight with the cops. And this is supposed to serve as an inspiration for the rest of the workers to lash out to the capitalist system and, I guess, spontaneously start a revolution. So what they think will come of demonstrations like this, we can only guess at, but we know exactly what the end result of demonstrations are which is it does not escalate the struggle. It does not gain any concrete gains for the working class. What ends up is the movement ends up getting smashed up. Police now have a perfect excuse to come into this protest, destroy it, smash it up, and say these people are violent, they want to destroy things, and the things that are destroyed, the city ends up having to pay for, which, of course, who pays for the city? We do. This money can be going towards schools, towards transit, things like that. And in the end, nothing really positive comes out of movements of actions like that. And in a broader context, it doesn't even have an empowering effect on the working class. It has quite the opposite. Psychologically, even if tactics like Black Bloc were successful, it ends up dulling the working class people's incentive to organize themselves and to educate themselves on how to go about having these movements and revolutions. Because then it creates the idea that what you need to do is wait for an outsider to come in and do actions like this to help to fight your battles for you. We as Marxists, of course, totally oppose this because we know that no outside group can come and liberate the working class. The working class has to liberate themselves, you know. But we haven't seen a lot of black blocs come out of the Occupy movement, but the same basic outlook is still at play. Anytime you talk to an occupier, anytime an Occupy GA happens or an Occupy discussion happens, and discussion about strategy comes up, you inevitably hear the term diversity of tactics come up. Diversity of tactics, diversity of tactics. This is something that came about in the 90s during the anti-globalization movement, and it was a way for anarchists to respect each other's personal ideas of how to go about demonstrating, so that the people who were more militant anarchists who want to go out and destroy cars and shoot cops and all that could have their protests on their own, and then the peaceful anarchists who want to just demonstrate, march, and rally could have their thing on their own, and they wouldn't have to disturb each other. What this ends up doing is doing away with any real discussion about tactics. It ends up short-circuiting the idea of tactics and discussion of tactics and strategy. A lot of times when you go to Occupy GAs, it certainly happened a lot in Occupy Boston, was when the discussion of strategy would come up, when the discussion of tactics would come up, it would be, you would hear diversity of tactics. And a lot of times anarchists would just end up boycotting the whole discussion, just walking off and doing the whole thing because it's too authoritarian to ask them to join in the discussion about what is best for the movement as a whole. It doesn't really, when you do that, when you go off and boycott the discussion altogether, it's not really respecting other people's beliefs because you're going against what the group directly wants. So it's not really fulfilling its role even as supposedly meeting everyone's aims and wanting respect for their own actions. So we as Marxists say that if we want to defeat capitalism, We need coordinated mass action for working class is what we need. We need to, through actions like that, working class develops organizations, and of course we make a much greater impact together than we do when we're separate. For example, Social Alternative sister organization in the UK, Socialist Party of Freedom of Wales, was instrumental in organizing a mass public, one-day public sector general strike in Britain. It brought millions of people into the streets. It was one of the biggest general strikes that Britain's ever seen in their history. And the Social Party was able to do that by putting out a clear program with concrete goals and appealing to the broadest layers of the working class they possibly could, getting all of the trade unions involved in this action. The Occupy movement is organizing their own general strike here in the United States on May 1st, and we'll see what comes of that.
And he said that his
so, you know, in the end, because of the unclarity of anarchism, you don't necessarily have to do anything specific to become an anarchist. You know, it's like you don't have to go you don't have to take part in campaigns, you don't have to go to meetings, you don't have to build an organization, you don't have to engage in debate with the public, and you don't have to do any kind of collective activity necessarily whatsoever. But we have to be careful about how we criticize anarchists on an individual basis. We don't want to. What we want to do is we want to discuss with them and find points of unity and places, ways that we can work with each other. Because a lot of working class people don't come to anarchism necessarily because of you know concrete objections with specific ways of going about movements. They come to it because they're sick of all the same old shit, right? They come to it because they're tired of seeing these like I said earlier, these parties that don't care about them, a system that's rejected them and thrown them on the scrap heap, and other workers' movements that have gone by the wayside and not fulfill their goal, and they just want to see the revolution. These are some of the most passionate people that are fighting for these things, and the most idealistic people. We don't want to turn them away. We want to turn them off and say that, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Your ideas are childish, whatever. You know, we want to engage with them. We find points of unity with them, how we can work with them. But we should also remain sharp on the ideas, the political objections that we have with anarchism, and why we feel that it's a bankrupt ideology that won't bring about a working class revolution. But we should be clear that an ideology that crumbles at the test of revolution isn't a revolutionary ideology at all. Thank you.
All right, so I had everybody's names and then the group expanded about 5 times after that. So I'm going to go back to my original tactic of the color of your shirt. So I'm going to take stack. If anybody wants to get on, take Patrick, Skeet, Kate, jobs, scratch fees, savings services. Bill, do you want to start?
Yeah. How to begin? Okay. First off, on a procedure note, tomorrow there's a PDA debate. They're coming to the conference and they're going to sort of talk to the Democratic Party. They're not into Catholics, right? Yeah, I found it striking that.
The message was really.
I think we ended the talk on a very good point. It's important that we all figure out ways to organize together because we do share a lot of the same interests.
So that much really.
I was surprised that there wasn't actually an anarchist talk. I think that would be a great example.
We did at one point invite an anarchist organization.
Everyone involved with March learned a lot of new skills.
You'll have to put up with me. I want to be really quick in respect to that. Rejecting the state, that's right. Rejecting hierarchy, that's right. State and capitalism intertwined, we totally agree with Engels on that. You can't remove that. You know, a lot of that's where the libertarians and the anarcho-capitalists get it wrong. You can't have capitalism without the state. They need it. However, I think your point about really the ultimate test of ideology is what happens when it's put in practice. And that in the end, anarchists and anarchists all have sort of the same end goal. But it's worth pointing out that really authoritarian strains happened well before Stalin, even well before the Civil War started. You had the gerrymandering of Petrograd Soviets to stack Bolsheviks to maintain the majority. You had the abolition of other revolutionary parties. You had abolition of free speech in the press, Pravda, etc. You had workplaces with Red Guards stationed there. Trotsky himself reinstituted the death penalty. Eventually, within a year, workplaces were appointed by
can do, you know, so the
run by appointed Soviet managers from the Central
and
Party.
at the moment, you know,
When
I'd say that there's a bit of a
Trotsky
dip in a movement
very
to
well
encourage young
put
people,
that
in Britain.
you should plan for exceptional
The end of
circumstances. Things are
2010,
complicated.
there's
Lenin
been
said that
a
too.
movement.
There's never going to be an
Against
easy
institution
revolution.
fees.
There's always going to be a civil war.
Hundreds of
There's
thousands
always
of
going to be
students took part in that,
hardships.
but the movement wasn't
That's why I think a lot of the excuses
and
that
it's also
timeless the war on you can't get workers if there's only means of production because there's a war. I mean, to know there's going to be a war. And if Lenin can deal with that, I think that's a pretty strong blow against it.
can have quite a big
I think
impact.
Spain mostly right on the usual Leninist line is that the anarchists lost because they actually engaged with us. Earlier than the previous argument was that they didn't engage with us.
Actually, they joined the Popular Front government. They joined the government. The
Exactly.
bourgeois government, the anarchists. Joined the bourgeois government.
And it's worth noting that not all anarchists, Friends of Jerusalem actually, the very few Trotskyists who were in Spain at the time, there was a lot of back and forth between them. Not outside the Republic and independent, I think they were really consistent with themselves. In terms of the Black Bloc and Occupy, it's worth noting that there was a very small, if any, Black Bloc presence among which is on one hand surprising because many of the sort of like organizing nucleus of a lot of these occupations were the same kind of people that they tend to do. You know, if their strategy called for a Black Bloc, so I think there is a sense that there's some strategy there. The police will come and smash the programs no matter what. Black Bloc or not. I totally agree that there are many instances where people who are instituting violence, certainly, I mean, I don't really consider property violence as real violence, but I think the media does, and that's a real practical question. So I think they're comfortable, they aren't appropriate at all. And you know, in terms of final analysis, I think we really agree on this kind of stuff. I think it's a question of examining the history, and I think, you know, personally, a lot of anarchists are a little wary because the times that Marxists have come into power were usually the ones that get shot. If you look at you know, Makhno, if you look at a lot of the, I mean, later Stalin was even better at shooting in the Spanish Civil War, but that's my brief reaction, and I'm sorry for being
No, it's wonderful.
So about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the LPC, the Lucy Parsons Center in Jamaica, had a book talk with a Greek anarchist who wrote Revolt Crisis in Greece with the Occupy London project. And we all went back to my house and drank afterwards. And one of the, I lived with a bunch of alternative people. So it was, there was some pretty heated political discussion. It was a lot of fun. But anyhow, Evan was talking about this conference, and he said, "Oh, well, there's a Marxist versus anarchist talk." And the Greek fellow, his name is Dimitris, he chimes in, he's like, "I know who wins." Needless to say, I would disagree with a lot of the historical analysis that you put forward. I thank you for saying what you did, because I wasn't capable of saying that right now. And in terms of tactical analysis, where we differ, I would say, I would put forward that in the 21st century, not just anarchism, a lot of the unaffiliated Marxist parties or organizations are moving theory forward at a much greater rate than traditional Marxist parties that rely on traditional models of worker struggle, mass party building, things like that. And you're right that we have to see how it plays out in practice, but the 21st century is a lot different than the 20th century, and we're still scrambling to get a grasp on that, especially in post-industrial Western countries. So I think the jury's still sort of out on what models are going to be effective tools in organizing and continuing the struggles. So I think that anarchists bring a lot to the table in terms of that. I think that in Greece right now, anarchists are precipitating the crisis and are some of the only ones with a cognizant analysis of the situation. There's also a lot of far-left Marxist groups that would sort of echo their analysis too. But in terms of the importance and in terms of the draw on the youth culture in Greece and a lot of European countries undergoing crisis, anarchism is a really important ideology. So I think that, to conclude, that a more serious discussion about tactics and theory and analysis should happen, one that is more back and forth, because we all learn a lot from each other.
Answering some of the criticism of the anarchists, many Marxists might point out the horrible situation Russia was in after the Russian Revolution, after the First World War, a devastating civil war that destroyed almost half the economy. Much of the Russian working class was destroyed at the time. They were dispersed back into the countryside. It was a nightmare situation they were facing, so it wasn't the best possible situation. There's a great, interesting book, I don't know if you've read it, Memoirs of a Revolutionist by Victor Serge. He was a Belgian anarchist, but he joined the Bolsheviks. It describes the gradual degeneration the revolution faced because of the situation it was in, because of the material conditions. The Bolsheviks did make some mistakes. They weren't the best at what they did. They were the only ones who were doing it. It was the first time the working class had taken power. It kept it. Palestinians had kept it for about 2 months. But the working class took state power. They actually kept it, which was the first time anyone's ever done that. They did make some mistakes. One of the major mistakes like patriotism. They were kind of paranoid about the Mensheviks and anarchists, and maybe some paranoia was completely understandable. If the whites or the enemies had won, they would have exterminated the Russian working class. That was the horrible situation they were in. In terms of Makhno, he was a cool guy, an interesting person in some ways. He couldn't discipline his organization. Like his group in Ukraine were guilty of pogroms, massacres of Jews. He wasn't anti-Semitic himself. He fought against anti-Semitism, but his organization was very chaotic. My understanding tried very hard to work out some kind of deal with Makhno, and it just didn't work out. Things could have gone in a different direction. Russia was facing a nightmare situation at the time. So these are some things. Kronstadt was a tragedy. But you know, even the left opposition, Alexander Valentine, or whatever the workers' opposition, voted in favor of suppressing the Kronstadt. The Bolsheviks, even they were in favor of suppressing it, basically. So it's kind of a complicated situation. It was a tragedy, but that's the situation we were facing. Now, in terms of bloc tactics, briefly, and it's kind of ironic that many anarchists disagree with, just like what they call vanguardism or they say Leninist authoritarianism, but bloc tactics essentially are very vanguardist, and because they're leading people, protesters, demonstrators in the direction many people are not comfortable going in. No.
Also, I think we have to
say, basically every system that anybody puts forward, there's going to be a approach. And I think the only way to combat something like that is to learn from our history and to come forward with through education and organization and just planning. That'll definitely narrow the chances for progression. There's room for greed and stuff everywhere. There's possibilities for dictatorship no matter what system we're facing right now. So it's just
we couldn't even sell vegetables.
Learn from our mistakes and educating our history.
I wanted to thank Patrick and Steve for raising the points. For raising the points, because I think that this is a vital discussion actually. And it's important to be able to separate, and I think the point was made, between what we're facing today was made by, because a lot of the Occupy movement in many ways it resembles more an early Prudhonism, which was a form of cooperativism, rather than, I'm sorry, rather than the more...
You guys too.
Rather than the more developed ideas of anarchism that we see in the 1930s, of Spanish anarchism, or First International anarchism that we see, which had certain basis on the working class at that stage. And I think it's important to be able to differentiate. I think it's important to study some. A lot of the people made the point to study some of the historical points that have been raised, because they're raised with some intensity. They usually, and I think that what is needed is a more sober, objective, if you like, assessment. For example, on the question who got shot first, that Patrick asked, actually it was this movement, the Trotskyist movement, which was most thoroughly, virtually, the entire Bolshevik party was exterminated by Stalinism. The entire Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party was exterminated by the Stalinist counter-revolutionary movement. That was not because this was Marxism. It was because it was a Trotskyism, quite correctly said about Stalinism. It was a counter-revolutionary. It was a counter-revolution. It was not the form of workers' democracy that Lenin or Marx or Bolshevism had truly in mind. And I think it's very important. There's a number of important points that were raised about, for example, about the early Russian Revolution, and they merit, and there is a great deal of excellent new material after the collapse of Stalinism, of authentic research that is no longer controlled by the Stalinists or by the bourgeois academics and so on. For example, in relation to the early worker state and what was the decisions taken on everything else. For example, on the question of the abolition of for example, the Bolsheviks never took power on their own. The first workers' government in Russia was a coalition government between the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the left SR. And actually, I would venture to say that the best elements of anarchists at the time were part of that coalition. That coalition fell apart, however, when the leader of the SR shot Lenin. It was not just saying, well, we disagree with you. They shot Lenin, and it was an issue. It was the issue, as Kate quite correctly points out, of extremely difficult conditions for the working class on those conditions in a very practical. On the question of today's conditions, right, of the discussion, where it's at, I think that the issue of Bank of America has come up, right? People have seen this debate about Bank of America. And there are many different views about how to deal with Bank of America, and I like this because it's a concrete way of approaching it from a Marxist perspective or from a variety of other perspectives. For example, in Occupy, there are views saying, break it up, break Bank of America. One of the answers that comes from, I would say, the more traditional anarchist view would be, what is the answer regarding Bank of America? And they would say, Bank of America, break it up into many small little capitalist banks. Actually, that is the main argument that's coming forward. It's like, break it up so it's not so big, and so on. Now, Marxists would disagree with that. Marxists say, no, we want to nationalize it and under democratic workers' control. That way, you can actually use the enormous deposits that exist, the enormous amount of money that exists. I think they have almost $1 trillion in assets. Could be used for meaningful investment in the economy. There are other views inside. For example, let's go outside Bank of America and demonstrate. There are other views that say, let's go out and black bloc views. Let's go out and break their windows. There are other views that say, well, let's go out and sprinkle, with sprinkles. These views are heard it, The point about this, though, I'm trying to say is that many different views about how to approach Bank of America. You see, the view that Marxists argue, I think, and arguments can be made. So turning it into a cooperative, and I'll finish with this, is that the Marxists advocate a very specific view in the sense that we demand to organize a movement that says nationalize, bring this under democratic workers' control management. It's a concrete issue, and I agree. We have to get beyond simply the Marxists, and then by Marx we mean Stalinists, and we say anarchists. By anarchists we mean black bloc, because it's not all anarchists and not all black bloc. So we have to be able to say, on policy, what do you say? On the Bank of America, what is your policy? Should we have demands or not? What demands are those? Are they demands for the idea of, all of those are the points. That's the best way, in a concrete way, to approach the discussion of Marxism, as well as doing the analysis and theory that we need to also do. I apologize for taking so much time.
Okay, I just had a couple of things. I don't have much to say about this because not an anarchist. But one of the things that I would like to point out is that actually called anarchism a symptom of failure of Marxism. So, it's kind of telling that they didn't really, they existed together for sure, but the point really is that there's some sort of historical theory about Marxism sort of experience and anarchism grows out of that failure. And that's, I don't think, but that's sort of something else. As far as some of the things that you were saying about Banks of America or tactics that you have, I find it sort of intriguing that you can, and also socialist alternative, which is another mention that I'm familiar with, but incidentally, one of the speakers is speaking at Harvard on Monday. I am from that affiliate society, so I went from that. So what I thought was kind of interesting was that the idea that sort of, Marxists today, or let's say sort of socialist alternative, but also has the right idea. We just have to do it. We just have to find, we just have to get the 10 million voters that we need to find in this party, and then we can sort of take over the state, whether it's through a third party. Or whether it's through sort of, and sort of a revolution. And that's kind of, I mean, it's kind of interesting that it's like the entire history of the 20th century, which I would argue, or Flatters would argue, is a history of a series of defeats that the left experienced. Both the Marxists, but also the anarchists, actually. It's those are things like, for example, the 30s or the 60s, as sort of like significant turns or significant shifts in the history of the left itself, where the left essentially sort of went away from a sort of radical position that what it inspired me in the first half of like the 20th century to what we see now, where not only it's not so much a question of whether there is a workers' movement or not, but really the fact is that there is a sort of global, there was a sort of global press. Like, if you, it's kind of interesting when you read about the 20s or 30s. It's very easy to get nostalgic about that moment. Sort of like workers weren't workers. They weren't sort of like going and turning screws. They were sort of they were reading Shakespeare. They were sort of they had a cultural life and all these things, and we don't have that anymore. So of course it's very easy to get nostalgic about those things. But really the point is that it's actually the Marxists are not in the same place today as they were then. So to think that sort of Marxism is like sort of about a third party or sort of let's nationalize it or something like that. So actually I would argue that thinking about the question of Marxism only in terms of how Marxists think about the Bank of America versus anarchists, and that's towards something. It's really sort of confusing to me because actually what Marxists do is recognize that that the 20th century is been a history has been sort of century defeats, and you actually overcome those defeats and sort of understand them historically as defeats. I mean, I find it sort of surprising that there is sort of like a third party position. I mean, I guess this is a big point because that's what socialism does. I think it's kind of impossible to have that discussion here, but it's. I mean, to me, it would seem that is some support from labor unions, but it wasn't overwhelming. The sort of like the recognition of Marxism as a historical idea, not as something that Marx wrote and then a few people tried out, but we can start from scratch all over again. Is to me just it seems like it's wrong. That's all.
All right, I got Tom.
Well, yeah, I'm glad to be in this workshop because I try to think. Thinking is hard, and hearing other people who come in with a diverse range of views doesn't necessarily help my thinking to coalesce. But I wanted to talk about one of the basics, as I see it, of the Marxist analysis is the class-based analysis, that there is a class system, and the bosses and the workers, the 1% and the 99%, and that so I think it's important to, and that I think is real, and I think you start from a reality base of whether you are followers of Proudhon, neo-Proudhonism, or whether you are nostalgic for some other thing, or you have an amalgam. You still, where are you in the class? What class are you in? And what do you do with first of all, you have to figure out who's in the class with you, and who is your class enemy, who's attacking you. And I wanted to just talk, so that's kind of a basic thing of how to think about it, which is too general. But, I mean, it's very general to say that, of course. I also wanted to mention that what I saw, and I wasn't hugely active in the Occupy movement. I kind of see it as having a real sort of utopian sort of character to it, like new ways of communicating or new attempts to communicate, hand jive, etc. Mic checks, etc. I thought, just to be a little satirical, I thought mic checks when there were big, very good sound systems was kind of strange. But to me, it seemed to be about, in some ways, about how do we make a fully functional microcosm in the midst of everything. That seemed utopian to me. Because I thought that there were millions of people who were not in the encampments, who are part of the 99%, who are part of the class, and who are under attack. So reaching them seemed to me, and still seems to me, a lot more important. Now I think that if you then making the perfect encampment, or making even a sustainable encampment, that's just me. But I also think that you have to look at what are the forces in the production process itself. People are talking about a post-industrial realm, or a new way to look at the economy. Well, everything is still produced, whether it's produced here or produced someplace else. It's still produced. There's still the working class. And in a globalized economy, it's, as was said early in the beginning, we really do need to look at this internationally. For instance, I don't know what the living wage is everywhere. It's maybe different, but I know there is a living wage to be obtained in every situation of oppressed workers. So, how best to do that, I feel, is to build a party, an organized party, a revolutionary party, party building. And I think we have to re-examine that and see how to do that in today's terms. We need a place where we can have working class democracy. We have to have a grassroots democratic party, not a delegated, who has the money party, but a party of ordinary people. And it can't just be a talk shop. It has to be a party of action. And so it has to stress party discipline. It has to stress organization. We have to have full democracy, but then when we have a democratic decision by voting, we have to step off together. That way, I think we'll organize, and I think that's the way we can make our best appeal to working people, both in unions and non-unionized work settings, because they have concrete issues to face. One thing I think, and I'll end here, one thing I think about the Occupy movement is when the encampments were busted, which is, of course, I think the power of the state to bust the people. Best example going on all over the world. One of the best. When it became decentralized, it went out into the communities where people live, and came out there with an idea of mobilizing on a community basis. Local issues, education, jobs, the situations in our various communities. They come face to face with concrete issues, and people who don't really care about jazz hands. They just care about solving those issues. Sorry to sound disrespectful, but that's kind of how I see it. And I hope there'll be a future, and I think there is a future for that. I think decentralized Occupy movement is a great innovation, and I credit the Occupy movement for it.
Brian?
Rather than go into anarchist area, I just
that's why I just want to talk about the actual state of anarchism as a movement, how it manifests itself, particularly in Occupy or the events in Greece. Well, historically, back in the day, anarchists did have, to some extent, roots in the working class. I think had an acknowledgement of the class system under which we live and so forth. You know, worked alongside with Marxists, and we saw that we can debate about the merit of one theory over another till we're blue in the face. And I acknowledge that there are still a lot of anarchists who do ascribe to that kind of theory. But when you get down to it, when you look at what anarchism actually is today, when you look at spend a lot of time at the Occupy movement, and what are anarchist demands? What does an anarchist movement look like? Is it a movement at all? Can you have a mass movement of individualists? The demands ranging from everything that the Ford Foundation will be happy to fund. The Democratic Party will be glad to jump on board with, all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Things that ideas that really alienate working people. And when large sections of the Occupy movement, we're in agreement on moving forward, on ways to move forward with the Occupy movement. And I'm not saying all anarchists, but an anarchist tendency did kind of ironically dominate that discussion to the point where we avoided politics altogether. Where we weren't formulating demands, we weren't formulating a way forward.
But on the other hand,
on the issues that really actually mean something to people, it became more about these like lofty kind of high-minded ideals of individualism, which that's not the way the world works.
Alright, so I have about 5 minutes left on the scheduled time. I have one new person on stage, one repeat, 2 repeats. We have new people that want to go with 3 repeats. Okay. It's a good discussion.
Alright, cool. I'm sorry, my name is Emmanuel. I'm also part of the Platypus Affiliate Society. And
I'm sorry, the what? You're
part of the Platypus Affiliate Society as well. So I'm probably going to make some really like unsophisticated remarks regarding like what accounts for the incidence or like the recent popularity or like maybe the echo of anarchism in our movement right now. And I will start earlier by one of the first comments that I heard regarding like, you don't have to be part of an organization, you don't have to do like lots of things to become an anarchist. And I was wondering about one of the things that I wasn't really active in Occupy either, but the only thing that it held promise to me was the possibility of civil community or like civil society to be reconstituted in a time in which, as you pointed out, everything is so atomized and people have these really high-minded goals, which I think are totally worthwhile. I mean, on the one hand, Marx himself said the free development of all is to be the precondition for the development of your own individual needs. And I think one of the problems with Marxism is that we are, and I consider myself, want to be Marxist, is that we replicate capitalism in such a way through our conservative demands because we're conserving that kernel of what is it that allowed 1917 to happen. We did, was that society in a way healthier in that people were more engaged in the community, whereas now, there's like 5 people in a room and there's literally like 10 mindsets going on based on whatever's going in your head. Just because the self today is more complicated than it was in 1917. Like, what you dream about is more complicated. I think so. I mean, and maybe it's more deformed. I mean, whatever it is. I think we definitely live in different conditions. Subjectivity today is different. Anyhow, so what I wanted to say is like, why is it that anarchism, like, I do think anarchism is a symptom of Marxism's failure to engage in the working class or to engage in what's going to be the revolutionary subject. So why is it that the anarchists are bourgeois, suburban people, or people who represent suburban? What accounts for that? What motivates, anarchists coming out? And I think, I think that should be what we discuss. And we should almost do it in a sociological way, like, how many women are anarchists? Why does that matter, That's all I wanted to say.
Alright, so I have 2 minutes, but because I have 3 people on my I'm going to give a 3-minute and have to each of us because speed the taxi anti-capitalist
Okay, mostly in response to Brian, I think it's really unfortunate that a lot of the people in Boston, a lot of socialists that I associate with and live with and talk to regularly, that their major impression of anarchism is based off of the direct action kids that occupy Boston. Not to belittle anybody, but I think that is representative of what anarchism is in this country. It's a right now, a very confused and immature movement. If you want to, if only you could talk to anarchists who are representative of a mature and strong movement. If only the people that you were talking to, if only direct action in Occupy Boston was composed of people who have been involved in intense struggle for a long time. I think that would have changed drastically. And so, when talking about anarchist demands and what you saw as a lack of direction, I feel that that's also representative of a period and a movement that doesn't really have its feet under it or know where to go. But in other instances, anarchism, I hate this time thing, sorry.
It's your lunch hour.
Okay, so anyway, the demands of anarchists in a lot of instances are not political demands as such. Anarchists are very interested in creating and preserving spaces, anarchists and radical spaces. And I think that this is a really great and interesting manifestation of radical thought in our current situation. And Occupy itself is representative of that. So, and the struggle in Greece, I go back to this a lot because it's a pretty pitched struggle right now. You see a lot of Marxists talking about the sort of party line that you guys are talking about, and you see anarchists skewing that completely. And maybe Ryan could say, in regards to that, well, obviously there's no demand, there's no political direction here. But what anarchists are doing is very important in that struggle. And in fact, you could say that in the very same sense that Occupy and occupations in the public squares in America create an environment where all of these other things can happen, what anarchists are doing in Greece is occupying buildings and taking squares and converting them into parks, and also being very militant in their direct action. So they are providing very real direction. It's just not political direction in the traditional sense. So I think it's like sort of a straw man to say, well, anarchism, as I understand it, because I've talked to some in Occupy Boston, it is devoid of political direction. His daily routine.
Okay. Real quick, to your comments, it's a great example of how not to be cooperative in anti-capitalist movements. Same with calling anarchism a symptom of larger problem.
That's the way you don't have discourses, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But it's, in terms of a mass movement of individualists, obviously that can't happen, which is why the anarchist movement is not a movement of individuals. I think that's a really useful caricature in some situations. But I mean, the whole idea of breaking through atomized social relations is the core essence of
prefigurative politics, which is, I mean, that's the really heart of Occupy Wall Street and other occupations. It's the idea that if we want a liberated democratic world, the means by which we get there has to be democratic. It can't be centralized. It can't be hierarchical. See, in terms of demands not formulated, I think there's almost a consensus that the reason there weren't any demands was a key asset for the occupation that it was able to grow, and it became this central meeting place where all sorts of movements could sort of grow and have as a base of action. It was really useful, especially in Occupy Boston. What would an anarchist movement look like? You can look at a lot of examples right now. Seattle Solidarity Network, the Boston affiliate, those are very anarchist inspired organizations. You have the Zapatistas, you have really Occupy Wall Street, you have the IWW, you have Food Not Bombs, you have community organizations all over the country. Simply because they don't form as a party, they don't have a headquarters in Chicago, I mean, that doesn't mean they don't exist. If you look for them, I think you will. And I think if you have a chance to actually interact with them, I think you'll find we have a lot in common. And that really, none of us are caricatures of what we often think we are.
Thank you. All right, so that was a pretty good discussion, I thought. We're running a little over time, but that's okay. It's lunch. We're going to have time to kind of try to pull all the strings together, close it up.
Good luck.
Yeah, I think it was a great discussion. A lot of great points came up. I really hope that people who are anarchists or people who sympathize with anarchism would come to this discussion, voice their concerns, voice the things that they liked, things they didn't like, and so on. I think Brian kind of hit it on the nose and touched on it as well. What would an anarchist movement look like? The truest answer we can give is there's no way to tell. There's really no way. It can lean on the working class and focus on trade unionism like the IWW does. It can focus on more community activism like Food Not Bombs. It can try to build movements across the nation like Occupy Wall Street does. It can do all sorts of things. And there's not really, and that's part of the thing about anarchism. It's difficult to criticize and say anarchists do this, anarchists do that, because there's so many of them and they don't all agree on any particular issues really. It's difficult to say anarchism is this, anarchism is that. And I like what Steve said, and it's true that it's frustrating to see anarchism characterized by its loudest, most violent members as the direct action committees, because not all anarchists do feel that way. But I also think that it's not fair to categorize anarchism as a bourgeois ideology, because I think if you told a soldier in the Spanish Revolution that he was bourgeois, you'd probably shoot him in the face. And so there have been militant anarchists, there have been working class anarchists, people who want to see revolution come about. And we've talked a lot about theory. I talked a lot about theory in my talk, but honestly, I think theory is a necessary evil in a lot of senses. That it's very easy to get caught up in theory and get wrapped up in it and feel like getting caught up in the debate and who's more right and who has a better understanding of history. What really is important is what campaigns win. What kind of tactics, what kind of strategy will actually win concrete benefits for working people? And I think that it is, while 21st century society is more complicated in some instances. We have Twitter, we have cars are easily accessible to everyone, better infrastructure. But look at the program that the Bolsheviks came to power on. The Bolsheviks came to power on a program of peace, on a program of building roads and healthcare for everyone and education. Those are the same demands that are being put forward today. The working class hasn't changed in the sense of what it actually wants, what it actually needs, and what it's going to go out in the streets and fight for. In that sense, it's not more complicated. It's the same in that respect. And there's a lot of stuff that came out. I'm not going to be able to focus on all of it. Let me see the more important things. Not going to talk about there was a lot of complicated stuff. It would take all day to bring all the points. I don't want to go on about what happened in Kronstadt, who shot first, or Soviet Union and all of that. There's a lot of things. We could have a whole day to talk about that and wouldn't bring it all out. But again, you have to look at what campaigns win. You haven't seen in history of the world. You've never seen a movement bring about revolutionary struggle, bring about revolutionary change just by setting up a tent in the park. It has to be bigger than that. It has to be much bigger than that. It has to be what movements have brought change. We saw in France in 1968, the entire working class came out in a general strike that put the government in the air. And you're right, the police will always try to break it up, but they won't always succeed. They will succeed if the movement is divided. They will succeed if the movement is fractured and we have diversity of tactics in that sense. But they won't succeed if the working class is united. If the working class comes together on common goals and common aims, In France, you saw them put the government was in the air. The police could not move on them because they were just too strong. And they were strong because they were engaging in coordinated mass action. It was democratically discussed. And I don't think the 20th century is just, it is a history of defeats. There was a lot of defeats in the 20th century that we can learn from. There was a lot of successes as well. Because look at us today, we have a higher standard of living. I think it's because of the historic struggles in the 20th century that we can learn from, and draw from. I hope to see discussions between Marxists and anarchists in the future focus on strategy and tactics and not who shot first at Kronstadt. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.